The 100th anniversary of Ronald Reagan's birth is Sunday, and I could not possibly do this program without having my mentor, my dear, dear friend, who was so pivotal in so much of what Ronald Reagan did, Ed Meese. How are you, Ed Meese?
I'm fine, Mark. Good to talk to you and to your listeners.
It's a pleasure. I would like to ask you a few questions.
Sure.
You're out there now at the Reagan Library, about to go there, and by the way, say hi to my kids. They're going to be out there, too, if you don't mind.
Good. I'll look forward to seeing them.
I wanted to ask you something. When did you first meet Ronald Reagan?
It was in December of 1966. He had just won the election, and I had been asked if I would come up to Sacramento. I was, at that time, practicing law in Oakland, California. I was in the district attorney's office there, and I was asked if I would come up and meet the governor-elect. And I did, and I had, at that time, had never met with him or knew any. I knew a lot about him, of course, because he just won the election. But we talked. He talked to me for about a half hour. We talked about criminal justice, which is the field that I was in at the time. He asked me to be his legal affairs secretary at the end of that half hour, and I accepted on the spot, something I was surprised that I had done. But I was so impressed with him, how much he knew about my field, and how our ideas coincided that I looked forward to the chance to work for him.
Now, you didn't just come to his attention. You were pretty well known there with all these activities going on these campuses, these riots, and taking over different buildings and so forth. You helped develop a legal strategy for trying to deal with these campuses, didn't you?
Well, that's right. I was doing that for the district attorney's office, and I'd been involved in a number of the incidents, advising the police officers who were maintaining law and order at Berkeley particularly, and also in some of the demonstrations in the surrounding areas.
So you went to work for him, and early on, what did you think about what you'd done?
Well, I was tremendously impressed with him. He was very knowledgeable, a great person to talk to, a great leader, and I was really pleased that I'd made the decision to go to work for him.
Now, you stayed with him a very long time, didn't you?
Well, actually, it was 30 years, a little over 30 years from the time that I first met him and started work until he went into total seclusion, which was in the end of the 1990s.
Yeah.
And during that time, I'd worked for him, of course. I'd been his legal affairs secretary. Then I was chief of staff for him for the rest of. So I was with him the whole time he was governor. But then I served as the general counsel for his political action committee. Worked in the two campaigns in 1976 and then in 1980, and then worked in the White House, and then ultimately got into the Justice Department when he appointed me Attorney General. And of course, that's when you and I worked together.
Well, now, one of the things I want to talk about was when you were Attorney General and your desire to ensure that the United States Constitution would be complied with. And you decided to advance the case that it was high time that the legal establishment, the legal bureaucracy, that the courts look at the Constitution and actually try to comply with it, rather than this living and breathing stuff and so forth. And we call it originalism today. Tell us how that all came about.
Well, actually, that was another idea that really originated with Ronald Reagan. He'd been very much concerned about what we call judicial activism, where judges would substitute their own ideas or their own political doctrines or policy preferences for what the Constitution and the statutes enacted by Congress actually said. And in other words, they departed from the Constitution, and that's where this idea of originalism goes. It comes from the idea that we want to actually follow the Constitution itself, not what a bunch of judges who were not complying with it were actually saying. And that was an idea of the president's. It caused him to be very much involved personally in the appointment of judges, and also this was kind of a direction to the department. And so I had the opportunity to speak to the American Bar Association at their annual meeting, and we laid out this strategy for returning to the Constitution at that meeting. That was in June of 1985.
And needless to say, some people didn't very much like the idea, including at least one Supreme Court justice, right?
Well, that's right. There was a lot of opposition from the left and from some of those judges who I think felt that maybe this was being aimed at them and what they had done. And so we had a judge picked up on this, Justice, and debated the thing. And Justice Brennan gave a talk at the one of the law schools in Washington, and he took the other side, tried to minimize the importance of the Constitution, and so a debate broke out from that. And as a result, the Federalist Society, which was a group of lawyers and law students, wrote about the debate, published my original speech, published the justice's speech, and then the fight was on.
And the fight still goes on. And yet what's interesting to me is if you don't take an originalist approach, that is try to determine what was intended by the framers in the language that was used at the time, then what do you have? I mean, if the Constitution is to be framed in current thought and language, and it's a political expedient. So I honestly don't even understand the other side's position.
Well, you're absolutely right, Mark. If you had a contract, for example, with somebody, and one of the parties said, well, I don't care what the contract says, I want to do it my way, that's exactly what we have here when judges depart from the Constitution and substitute their own ideas of what they think it ought to read.
What do you think Ronald Reagan would say about the Tea Party movement?
I think he'd be very much interested in it, very much supportive, and I think he'd be very, very pleased that people are actually reading the Constitution and talking about the Constitution and comparing what Congress does, for example, as well as the courts, but particularly Congress, what the laws they pass, how closely that does or doesn't comply with what the Constitution actually says. He was a great student of the founding, as you know, believes thoroughly in what the original people who had founded our country had in mind, and I think he would be very proud that we were returning, at least to a greater extent than it has been in the past several decades, to people actually reading the Constitution.
What do you think Ronald Reagan would say? Look, I'm just asking you because you work so closely with him for so long. What do you think he'd say about the kind of policies that are being promoted by this president and what was formerly the Democrat Congress? They control the Senate now. What do you think he'd say about that?
Well, I think he would be appalled at the way in which the current administration is intruding into the freedom of the people and the way in which they are trying to expand the power of the federal government. He was a great believer in federalism, on the role of the states as the founders already had originally intended, and I think he would be very much concerned about the direction in which this country has been going, and I think he would have been gratified by the fact that the people were in effect rising up to try to return to the Constitution.
I'll bet he'd have a good laugh that probably the most radical president in modern times invokes his name.
Well, that's right. You know, it's interesting, Mark. I think you and I both are very gratified that Ronald Reagan is now the standard by which other presidents are measured, but more particularly in the last debate by both parties in 2008, prior to the election in the presidential debates, Ronald Reagan was the president most referred to by both parties as they discussed what a new president ought to be like.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ed Meese, first of all, I want to thank you publicly for all your service to this country. I mean, we even have judges on the bench now. You were crucial in advocating for them and encouraging their appointment, and they're still out there doing a magnificent job. You're still active as can be with the Heritage Foundation and other groups. You sit on the Landmark Legal Foundation's board. I just want to thank you very, very much, and have a good time out there.
Well, I sure will, Mark, and I want to thank you. You've been a very important part of our team, and your book on the Supreme Court and your book, Tyranny and Liberty, these things have been very important contributors to what I know Ronald Reagan would like to have happen in this country.
Well, God bless you, and my best to your family, too. So.
Thank you.
All right, take care. I can tell he has a cold, but this is a great man. But like all great men, the liberals always try to smear and destroy. Because that's what liberals do, smear and destroy. Ed Meese is a very modest man. He's a very humble man. He was Ronald Reagan's, certainly one of his closest advisors for his entire, almost throughout his governorship. Well, I think it was throughout his governorship and throughout his presidency. And he would turn to Ed Meese all the time for specific assistance when it was needed, to get information and to to help go through the information and to figure out, because an administration is big, who was doing what. And Reagan was a wonderful person to work for because he would delegate authority and would actually let you do what he thought you were supposed to do. All right, folks, that was Edwin Meese. We'll be right back.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. From time to time, we've been tempted to believe that society has become too complex to be managed by self-rule, that government by an elite group is superior to government for, by, and of the people. Well, if no one among us is capable of governing himself, then who among us has the capacity to govern someone else? We are a nation that has a government, not the other way around. And this makes us special among the nations of the earth. Our government has no power except that granted it by the people. It is time to check and reverse the growth of government, which shows signs of having grown beyond the consent of the governed. It is my intention to curb the size and influence of the federal establishment and to demand recognition of the distinction between the powers granted to the federal government and those reserved to the states or to the people. All of us need to be reminded that the federal government did not create the states. The states created the federal government.
Absolute genius and a ton of guts. Who talks like this today? Well, there are a handful. Michelle Bachmann talks like that. Sarah Palin talks like that. There are many others, too. I just can't remember everybody. But not enough. Absolutely not enough. A friend of mine, and you would know who it is, but I'm not going to reveal her, running around saying, this guy's great. He's from a blue state, but he's really great. I wrote back, I said, he's bad on guns. He's bad on the mosque issue, ground zero. He's bad on the environment. He campaigned for rhinos. And I went on, but he's good on spending, the person said. That's why he's not qualified to be president, because he's not good enough. We'll be right back.